I see there was consternation a week or so ago with everybody thinking we're getting blackouts. And of course, some of the municipalities have been talking about perhaps cutting power for certain areas on certain days. Is this something we're facing going into the winter?
Stephen, what happened was that some of the municipalities, Joburg was one of them, put out their load shedding schedules, which in fact have long been on their websites in which they update annually. But this caused consternation because I think people thought that meant we actually were about to load shed, which we are not planning to do. And if we were, we would certainly tell you. However, that doesn't mean that there isn't a challenge here. We have said that the power system is tight, that it will be tight for at least the next 2 years until we bring a lot of new capacity online from the end of 2012. And we are managing a tight system, and we're certainly urging everyone to partner with us to keep the lights on.
How tight is it though? Because you do have a reserve margin. Is that reserve margin almost at zero?
If you look at the reserve margin as such, it actually looks fine. The challenge, it's not as high as it should be, but it's at 14-ish%. And the aspiration would be upwards of 15%. That's not really the issue. I think in winter particularly, there's the issue of the winter peak, where you get demand for power jumping very sharply from about 5 to about 8. And in effect, we need an extra power station or two just to supply demand for just those 2 hours a day.
And you are planning an extra power station, so we'll talk about those later.
Very big, 2 very big ones. So in winter, there's at those 2 or 3 hours of peak, there's a challenge of managing through that peak. But also within the reserve margin, we need to allow space for maintenance, which we do much less of in winter, but we need more and more maintenance as our fleet ages. And we also need to allow for things to go wrong, which they do in any power station, and they certainly do with an aging fleet. And we need to allow ourselves at all times an operating reserve, which is sufficient from hour to hour and minute to minute to protect the system against any unplanned events. And I think when we talk about tight, we're talking about a situation where the risks are heightened. Where we're not comfortable that there's enough of a sort of an operating margin to take us through, for example, in winter, particularly that evening peak. And that's taking very careful management. But that is also one of the reasons why we are urging people to use energy more efficiently, which is something in South Africa we need to do anyway.
Well, I've heard those adverts on the radio where you ask people to switch their geysers off between 5 o'clock and 8 o'clock, those peak hours that you're talking about. Have consumers come to the party? Have you noticed any change since you started that campaign?
It's very hard to tell because you've got temperatures dropping. So we certainly still are getting quite... We saw an earlier than usual winter. It varies from day to day. We haven't got to the real winter peak yet, which is usually in July. But we're seeing some fairly high peaks. And we are also trying to fit in some last bits of maintenance ahead of the coldest part of winter. So that's taking some very careful management at those peak times. It's hard to tell at this point whether consumers are responding. We know that our big customers, some of our very largest mining and industrial customers, have done a lot on the energy efficiency front in the last 2 years or so. How much households have done, it's hard at this stage to tell. We imagine though that we are starting to get a response. We certainly hope so.
Well, there was some interruption to BHP Billiton's aluminium smelters earlier this week. And of course, that's part of the arrangement you have with BHP Billiton because they do have a special pricing arrangement. Was that part of the whole maintenance schedule? We call them the interruptibles. That's, as you say, part of the special pricing agreement which we've had, which goes way, way back. In fact, it's always been part of that agreement, that our ability to interrupt them really it's roughly 2 hours a week only. And that's something which we have always used at Eskom to manage the system, not only when capacity is in short supply, but even just to manage the frequency of the system. So we do use that as part of managing a system, and particularly managing a tight system. Oddly enough, we've actually used that less this May than in May last year, but certainly more than earlier in the year. And that is one of the tools that we have in the toolkit to manage the system. Does this go for some of your other large commercial customers as well?
That's a different arrangement. The interruptible arrangement is very specific to those 3 aluminium smelters and is part of the pricing agreement we have with them and is long-standing. What we also have quite separately is an arrangement with certain of our large customers where we can interrupt them with warning in return for compensation. Now that also goes back a few years. It's a limited number of customers who can, whose processes lend themselves to reducing their load rather than necessarily switching off altogether. We want to extend that program. We have about 500 megawatts available, and we are looking to extend that program.
Let's talk about the power stations. Of course, Medupi only coming on at the end of next year at the earliest, and Kusile is a couple of years beyond that. But you have been raising funds in the meantime, and I think a couple of announcements this week. You secured over $800 million from the Import-Export Bank in the US. You also got some $365 million from the ADB, though that I understand is for solar and wind projects, not necessarily for these plants. How's fundraising going for these plants?
Well, we said, you'll know that there was quite a lot of uncertainty early last year about where the funding was going to come from for the build program, and we talked about a funding gap early last year. But by the end of last year, we had translated that into a funding plan with support from government. And we do have a plan in place for that 300 billion of funding that we will need between now and 2017-2018 to fund Medupi, Kusile, and the third large project, which is Ingula, and the power lines that go with them. More than 3/4 of that funding has been secured, and we are really putting the building blocks in place for the build program. But we are comfortable now that that it's there, and it's just a question of rolling out the plan. The Kusile financing that you mentioned, which was from Export-Import Bank of the United States, is really an export credit, and it is to support our purchase of services, project management services from
okay, so that's
a
not
US
actually
company.
for the build program?
No, it is. It is. It's specifically related to project management services at Kusile. We're using quite a lot of export credit finance for the build program, because it's a good source of finance. In fact, before excluding the latest one, it was about 31 billion in export credit finance that we'd already raised. So this adds to that that's part of our funding mix.
Tell us about the funding mix. What's in there? Is it all just raised through debt markets?
Well, it's a mix. It's, as I said, export credits. It's development finance institutions. We have a large World Bank loan over 5 years. And we have local development bank financing from the Development Bank of South Africa and the African Development Bank. So those are two, plus local and international bond markets. So that's all in the mix, plus, of course, a certain amount of funding which we'd had from the government, which was already in the pot.
And how onerous is the repayment of all this financing going to be going forward for Eskom?
Well, it's all quite long-term financing, which is really structured so that it matches the build program itself. Yeah, because what you do get also is you get quite a spike in funding need before the power stations start coming in. But once the power stations go commercial, once each unit goes commercial, you start getting revenue in, as it were. So it's a question really of matching the in and the out.
There was talk at some stage of bringing private partners into some of these projects, so either the Kusile and Medupi plants or the nuclear plants going forward. Is that still on the table? Is that still a possibility?
There was one of the options that was looked at when the government and Eskom were looking to close the funding gap, was to bring in a partner. That proved not to be the best way of doing it, and instead the government, but one of the solutions was a very sizable extension of the government guarantees for the build program, which is now up to 350 billion rand in guarantees. So that was, with that support and very explicit support from the government, it's proved possible to do it through debt markets and all these other sources that we've mentioned, and no need. Longer term, look, beyond 2017, beyond the point at which we finish Kusile, there's no more that's on the drawing board, certainly not for Eskom. Government's integrated resource plan sets out a generation mix and an investment plan, if you like, for the next 20 years, and that integrated resource plan now needs to be rolled out. There's a sizable amount of nuclear which is planned for. The government hasn't yet allocated who will do that. We as Eskom would certainly like to lead a nuclear build. We've said that as part of our efforts to lower our own, to reduce our own carbon footprint in the long term. That would have to be done, we would imagine, in partnership, though I think it's early days to start talking about what that structure might be, especially since those decisions have yet to be made by government.
And there's been no change to those nuclear aspirations following the fallout that we saw in Japan a few months ago?
I think those decisions are really decisions for government to make. But as Eskom, we have a strategy to reduce our carbon footprint in the long term. I mean, coal will always be a very important part of the mix, but we want to reduce it. So nuclear as baseload power would be what we would see as a key way forward. There's lots of other things which the integrated resource plan sees coming into the mix, lots of renewables. Eskom's role in renewable energy, we see ourselves playing a small role in wind. We have a 100 megawatt wind project on the drawing board, and a bigger role perhaps in solar, particularly concentrated solar, and we have a 100 megawatt project there too. And the other funding that you mentioned this week came through from the African Development Bank, which is towards that clean energy investment.